Hello and welcome to our Parent Carer workshop. My name is Kaylee and I'm a behaviour specialist within Cognus who works with part of the autism service. So today I will be talking to you about supporting a young person to understand their autism diagnosis. Before we start out, it is important to remember that all of this information provided in the presentation is general information about autism and how this presents in children, based on both research and my own personal experience of working with children with autism. So you may find that not all of this information applies to your child, and that's because all children with an autism diagnosis present differently depending on where they are on the spectrum. And we always like to say that once you've met one child with autism, you have only met one child with autism. So please do hold that in mind when watching this presentation. So our plan for today, we will be focusing on helping a child to understand their autism diagnosis. So we will think about why it is important for the child to understand their diagnosis and to understand perhaps how they are responding to the environment around them and why. We will then focus on what you need as a lead adult to help explain this to your child. Next, we will think about when should you tell your child. So what is the right age or the stage in their life to approach this subject? And I think this is a question that comes up quite frequently from parents and carers, so we will touch on that. And finally, how should you tell your child? So what is the best way to help them understand, as this can be quite a complex term for a child, and also how this relates to them as an individual. So that's our plan for today and what we'll be working through in this parent carer workshop. So firstly, why is it important for your child to understand their autism diagnosis? So often a child is given a diagnosis of autism, and this isn't really explained to them what it is and what this means for them as an individual. So it tends to be a word that is given to describe your child with no real meaning for them. So this can then lead to a negative perception based on perhaps what they've heard about autism from TV, films, or other children, and can leave them feeling confused and sometimes upset. So therefore, providing your child with knowledge about what autism means, they can then have a greater knowledge about autism, which can aid decision making and can ensure that this knowledge is accurate and they are hearing all the correct facts rather than what other people say. So there are lots of positives about having autism, and it is really important to recognise these and celebrate the differences. So when we speak with the children about autism, this is what we are trying to focus on. Here on the slide is some research that was conducted by Miller and Pontian, and they found that negative reactions towards a diagnosis of autism are more likely if this is disclosed to the child at a later stage in their life, and the child has already encountered perhaps negative and inaccurate views of autism. So it may be that your child is already aware that they are different or react differently to the environment around them compared to other children. Therefore, being aware of their diagnosis can help them to understand this more clearly and make sense of these differences. But without being aware of their diagnosis, these differences can result in negative responses and in negative views of autism. So this is just to highlight the importance of a child being aware of their autism diagnosis, but also having a clear understanding of what this means for them. So let's have a think now about what do you as the adult need to give to help your child understand their autism diagnosis. So firstly, it's important to highlight all the positive aspects of autism. So we've spoken briefly about how your child may have developed perhaps negative connotations around autism based on what they've heard or what they've seen from other people. But there are so many positives as well, and that should be highlighted. So as part of my role within Cognus and the autism service, I also facilitate one-off understanding diagnosis sessions with children who are based in the London Borough of Sutton. And I go into school once a child has received their autism diagnosis, and I talk with the child about autism and how this relates to them and try and help them understand, because quite often they've heard this word or been told that they have autism, but not a real meaning about what this means for them. And what I try to do is I really focus on pulling out the positive aspects of autism and making the child aware of these. So in these sessions, we often describe autism as being able to do the same things as everyone else, but just perhaps in a different way. And quite often parents come to me and say, we haven't told our child about their autism diagnosis because we are worried that they will use it as an excuse to not try or do new things. So therefore, by explaining autism in this way, it highlights that the child can still do everything everyone else is doing, but perhaps they might just do this in a slightly different way. It is also about understanding your child better in order to support them in the best possible way. So having a knowledge of autism will help you understand perhaps why your child behaves in a particular way towards the environment and other people around them. And this can help you to respond in an appropriate way that will make your child feel safe. It is also important that you, as the adult, are aware of strategies that can help make your child feel at ease. So it might be initiating some structure, having sensory considerations, so putting all of these strategies in place, which we've spoken about in the previous parent carer workshops. And these can be quite simple strategies, so that can be put in easily, but it makes a great change to your child's anxiety level and can make them feel much more at ease and content. And you won't always know the answers. But by saying to your child, I will find out, or perhaps shall we find this out together, that can be a great way to find out those answers together with your child and to increase both of your knowledge around the topic of autism. So it is important that you as the adult keeps a calm and relaxed approach when talking to your child about autism and finding that right time and space to talk about it. As we said before, we want to highlight the positive aspects of autism. So perhaps talking about this when your child is distressed or in a space that isn't quiet or comfortable for your child may not be ideal. So just holding that in mind. So keeping all of these factors in mind can be really helpful to you as the adult to help engage with your child and have these conversations. So the next question that we come to is, when should you tell your child about their autism diagnosis? So when is that right time? So firstly, I think you as parents and carers should feel ready. So have you understood what this means for your child and you are ready to have these conversations with your child? It is also important that your child has the cognitive and communication skills to understand what you are trying to tell them. Otherwise, this may be taken in a completely different way. So, are they at that perhaps right age to start understanding how these differences may apply to them? If you feel that your child does not have these skills yet, you can always start by saying comments such as everyone is different or it's okay to be different, and just highlighting these differences between people both on the outside and in terms of their appearance and on the inside in terms of their personality. So I think holding those thoughts in mind about your child's cognitive ability and their communication skills mixed with, are you ready as a parent to have these conversations with your child, I think is really important to decide when is that right time. But it will be different for every child. So talking to other parents, you may hear, oh, we told our child when they were really young, or we haven't told our child yet. And I think every parent can make the correct decision around this. And you know your child best, so base it on your judgment of how you think your child will understand this and when is the right time. So, as I mentioned earlier, as part of my role at Cognus, I facilitate one-off sessions for children in the London Borough of Sutton who have received a diagnosis of autism. So, I usually meet the child in the school to help explain what autism is and how this may relate to the child. So other colleagues within the autism service also offer a traded version of this support, which is much more in-depth and is covered over a number of sessions, whereas the sessions I offer tend to just be an hour and it's more of sort of an overview and a quick session, but that is provided as a free service within Cognus. So now I'm going to talk through a bit about those sessions and what is covered in each of those sessions and what I cover in the understanding diagnosis session. So in the first session, we like to encourage the awareness of difference and highlighting that everyone is different on both the outside and the inside. So therefore, we get the child to fill in a picture about themselves, which you can see on the screen, showing their hair colour, eye colour, height, shoe size, etc. And then we talk about if perhaps I got everyone else in the class to fill this out, would they all be the same or would everyone look different? And the answer is that they wouldn't all look the same, no, because everyone looks different to each other. And I like to highlight that if we did all look the same, the world would be A, very boring, and also very confusing because we'd all be identical. So we highlight that everyone is different on the outside. And we also highlight that everyone has different fingerprints. So as you can see on the slide there, there's a picture of Rebecca, who facilitated the session, her fingerprint, and James, the child's fingerprints, and just showing how that they are different and that we are all unique and different on the outside. So that's part of the first session, identifying those differences about how we look and our appearance. We then go on to talk about things that the child is good at and perhaps things that they find trickier. And again, this is to highlight the differences between people and highlight the positive skills that your child has. So all the children I work with have things that they are good at, and this is part of the session is about drawing that out and celebrating that with the child. We then acknowledge that everyone can be good at things and there'll be things that they perhaps find trickier. And we want to normalise that fact that people are different to each other and that that is okay. So again, highlighting those positives and those strengths of your child out, and also getting them to acknowledge that people are different and good at different things and that that is okay. So once we've sort of covered the child on the outside and highlighted those differences in regards to their appearance, we then move on to thinking about the child on the inside. And what we mean by inside is personality. And I think that's really key to make sure your child is aware that when we're talking about the inside, we're talking about personality. So we want to emphasize that the child is a good person who is loved and supported by so many people, and that they can have strengths and talents, and that they can also make progress in areas that they find difficult. So I tend to go through a number of personality traits, such as those that are on the slide. And then we talk through with the child about why they think they're that personality trait or why that relates to them, and perhaps why it doesn't. And this also helps me to kind of get to know the child a bit more. And it's also quite a nice icebreaker. They get to tell me perhaps why they feel like they're silly or why they're hardworking. And I think it's just a really nice way to pull out those different personality traits, which again, other people in their class may have different personality traits, and highlighting those differences between people as well. So finally, at the end of the first session, we will get the child to choose the personality traits that they best think describes them and put these together to build up their picture of them on the inside. So, and then I talk with the child and say that if everyone in the class made one of these profiles, would they all look the same? And again, the answer is no, because everyone on the inside is different. We all have different personalities and like different things. So to summarise the first session, this is about highlighting the differences between people on both the outside and the inside, and that this is okay to be different to each other. And again, I like to say that if we were all the same and were all good at the same things or found the same things trickier, then the world would be a very boring and difficult place. So yeah, highlighting those differences and that is really okay is the main part of the first session. Next, we move on to the second session, and this is where we start to introduce the term autism to the children. So in the first session, we spoke about describing yourself in terms of personality traits, and this session is about highlighting that another way to describe yourselves is by saying, I am autistic or I have autism, and that this is okay. So it's getting used to saying the word autism and using this type of language. And then from this, we follow up by using visuals, books, or perhaps short video clips to help explain what autism is. And when we're explaining what autism is, we focus on highlighting the star, which you can see pictured on the slide. And I don't know if you remember, but back in the very first Parent Carer workshop, I explained this star. So we'll be talking about perhaps sensory differences, difficulties with social communication and social interaction, perhaps experiencing restrictive and repetitive behaviours, and feelings of anxiety that the child may experience. And again, this will be personalised to the child based on what they told me that they experience, and I talk about how that relates to their autism diagnosis. So we talk about each of these areas and how this is part of autism to help the child make sense about how their autism relates to them. Because as I said at the beginning, every child with autism can present differently. And I think these sessions are really important to personalise this to the child and help explain what it means for them specifically. I also find it really useful to use analogies to help explain autism. And I think children really enjoy hearing these analogies, and it helps them to make sense. Because, again, like I said, autism can be a very complex term to understand. So, the example on the slide states that people with autism are a bit like pens, and people without autism are a bit like pencils. So, are there more pencils than pens? Yes. So there are more people without autism than autism. But do we like pencils? Yes, we do. We like everyone, people with autism, people without autism. Are pens different to pencils? Yes, pens and pencils are different. Like people with autism are different to people without autism. But does this make pencils any better than pens? No, it doesn't. They both are able to do the same things, so they both are used as a method of writing, and they aren't better at all. So they just have their differences. So, for example, pencils we can rub out, whereas pens is more permanent. So, although they do the same things, they do the same thing in a different way. And again, that is to highlight that. And we want to highlight, again, like what I was saying before, that although people with autism are perhaps different to people without autism, they can still do the same things. It just again does that in a different way, and highlighting the positives about this, that it is good to be different. Another analogy that I also use involves these different operating systems that quite often children have seen or own themselves, so it's quite relatable. So I go across the symbols on the screen just to find out which ones the children are most familiar with, as this is the one I then tend to go with. So, for example, we've got Apple, we've got Android, then we've got PlayStation and Xbox. So I'm going to focus on the Apple and Android example. So I tend to talk about mobile phones, so an iPhone and a Samsung phone. So I start by asking the child, what are the similarities between both these phones? The answers are they both take pictures, you can make phone calls, you can go on the internet, you can send text messages. So they both tend to have the same function. But then I say what's different about both of these. And sometimes that can be quite difficult for the child to answer. But one thing that is different is the charger. So you can't use a Samsung charger to charge your iPhone because the port is different and they just don't work like that. So although they both charge, they both do this in a different way. And again, taking a photo on an iPhone, you might just swipe up from the bottom, whereas the Samsung phone, you might swipe across to get the camera up. So again, they both do the same things, the function of taking a photo, but they do this in different ways. And then you relate this back to autism. So although you have autism and perhaps other people don't, you can do the same things as the other people. You just might do this in a different way. And I think that this analogy is a really useful tool to use to help explain that although you have differences, you can do the same thing. And quite often, children can relate to an iPhone or a Samsung phone because they've seen both of these, or again, the PlayStation and the Xbox. So although you can both play games on the PlayStation and Xbox, you can't use a PlayStation game on an Xbox or a PlayStation controller on an Xbox. So they have the same functions, but they require differences. So again, it's just highlighting that to the child, and I find that this is a really useful way, and the child seems to grasp that concept by using this analogy. And then in the final part of the second session, we want to talk about how autism relates to the child, so a personal approach. So what we do is go through autistic characteristics. So again, based on research and also my own experience of working with children with autism, telling me what kind of sensory difficulties they experience in the environment, and we kind of go through all of these and talk about perhaps if the child themselves experiences similarities like this, and how that, and explaining that that's because of their autism. So talking about as you can see in the pictures, sensitivity to smells, perhaps sensitivity to loud noises, talking about some children who wear ear defenders, and explaining that that sensitivity to noise relates to the autism diagnosis. Perhaps certain foods that they find difficult to eat or like to eat the same sort of foods, because again, that relates back to those sensitivities. So yes, going through all of these characteristics and explaining how those relate to the child, I think is really important to help your child understand what autism means for them. So the main points to make in the second session is to highlight that children with autism is a way of thinking differently. So it's a way to describe people with similar talents to you, but also differences to you, and that thinking differently can be a good thing. And I think that's really important to highlight, again, that if we all thought in the same way, then we'd all be good at the same thing, we'd all be going after the same jobs because that's what we'd all be good at. So these differences are really important, and are really positive because we want to be able to think differently to other people so that we come up with new ideas and we can be creative. Also, that there are lots of other autistic people. So your child is not the only person in the world with autism. And later on in the sessions, we'll talk about more like celebrities and people in the public eye that have autism. And finally, that autism is not an illness. So it will not go away. Sometimes children say to me, oh, when will it go away? And just trying to reinforce that it's not going to go away, but it's about understanding that and how it relates to you. Also, reassuring that it's not going to hurt your child. I think that's also a fear of a child that sometimes comes up in these sessions. So just highlighting that it's not going to hurt your child. So these are the main points that we try to make within the second session. So next we move on to session 3, and the focus on this is talking to the children about other people in the world who have autism to show that they are not the only people. So we focus on celebrities, as a few of these that the children have known about, and they find it quite fascinating, I think, that people who perhaps they look up to or who know have autism as well, and they can relate to that. So I like to look on the screen, there's a lot of celebrities there. So the people that I tend to pull out are the creator of Pokemon, which is on the far right there. So most of the children that we work with have heard of Pokemon. And I explained that the creator of Pokemon has autism. And without his autism, he wouldn't have been able to create those amazing characters that have been so successful. And I think that's really important to highlight to these children and show that perhaps one of their role models is autistic as well. Also, down the bottom in the left hand corner, we have Stephen Wiltshire, who is an amazing artist. And he is someone who has autism. So I'm not sure if you know about Stephen Wiltshire, but he is someone who goes up in a helicopter, looks at a skyline, say of London, and then he has a photographic memory. So because of his autism, he can remember the details of these skylines, and then he goes back to his art gallery or his workshop, and he draws this from memory. So he's very talented, and he says that without his autism, he wouldn't be able to have that intense focus and intense focus for detail. So that really helps him. Also above him there, we have Carly Jones, who I like to bring up, especially when I'm talking about autism with girls, because she is someone whose autism wasn't diagnosed till the age of 32. So for a large part of her life, she spent not understanding why she perhaps experiences the world differently. And she has recently been awarded an MBE for her work with focusing and pulling that attention to girls with autism and how perhaps quite often they are diagnosed at a later stage. Um, so I think putting out these celebrities just helps to show the children that they aren't the only ones with autism, and look how all of these people are doing such great things, and because of their autism they are showing that creativity and their ways of thinking differently in their professions. The final part of the session is then doing a true and false card sort. So similar to what I did in the first parent carer workshop, this is to help distinguish between the facts and the fiction of what autism is. So like I said at the beginning of this presentation, children may have heard about the term autism, or perhaps seen things on TV, or people may have said things, and that can sometimes blur what is true and what is false about autism. So this card sort is a great way to try and clear up some of that, and help them to realise what is true and what is false. So there's some examples on the slide there which we use. So we cut those out and get the child to sort these into piles of true and false. So that is the end of the sessions that we'll go through with the child, and this hopefully by the end of the third session they have a great understanding of not just what autism is, but how that relates to them as an individual. And I think the feedback that we get from children is that this is really useful for them, and it makes much more sense to how they respond to the environment in their day-to-day life, and why perhaps they find some things more difficult than other children. So I would really recommend talking to your child about autism, using some of these techniques and analogies that I've mentioned, as I think this can be a great starting point to help your child understand what is autism and what that means for them. It is really nice to hear your successes that you have with your children, and perhaps using some of the strategies that we've provided in our parent carer workshops. So please do keep in touch and share these with us. Please email any of your successes that you have to the autism service at cognus.org.uk, as it'd be really nice to hear these, and to hear that some of the strategies that we have provided have been helpful for you, your child and your family. Before we finish our session today, I just wanted to highlight some resources that may be useful for you when talking to your child about autism. So on the slide is some examples of some books. So we've got Core Connections with Cognitive Behaviour Therapy, Encouraging Self-Esteem, Resilience and Wellbeing in Children. So this is a really great resource that I would recommend. Also, there's headspace.com, which is a great meditation for kids. So teaching the basics of meditation there. It's really short exercises, 10 minutes a day, which can be really beneficial for your child, and helping them to reduce anxiety and stay calm. Also, there's yoga websites, Relax with Kids. So yeah, check out some of these apps as well, which can be really great for your children. So if you want some resources, I'd recommend these ones on the slide. So thank you for joining me today. Again, if you do have any questions about the content provided, then please do contact the Autism Service by emailing theautismservice@cognus.org.uk, and someone will get back to you with an answer. Your feedback on this session is greatly appreciated in order for us to improve our service for other parents and carers. So if you do have a spare 2 minutes to follow the link on the slide, and the feedback link is also in the description under the video, that would be great. So once again, I'd like to thank you for joining me today, and I hope this has been helpful for you.